Good afternoon. I'm just going to remove the video of me and the floating meeting controls and start the talk. So I'm going to be talking about some priorities for documentation and archiving in Northeast India and across the border in the parts of Myanmar or Burma that border with Northeast India. So Northeast India is a linguistic hotspot. It's listed in Nick Evans's 2010 book as number 4 for diversity in the world after Papua New Guinea, Indonesia, and Nigeria. That's the whole country. But the Northeast is certainly the most linguistically diverse part of India, containing approximately 3% of the population, all the major religions, and at least 22% of the total languages for India. Of course, it depends how you define languages, but really there's a lot of languages there and multiple language families. So the area that we're talking about is that part of India which is shown in red on the map. It's a part that most people don't get to visit. It's a part that most Indians don't get to visit, and it's very linguistically, ethnically, religiously diverse. It's also a very long way from Kashmir. And I always put this in because almost every talk that I attend where people are present who haven't been there will ask me, is it close to Kashmir? The answer is, it isn't. Okay, so what kind of linguistic diversity have we got? Well, here's a map of the Naga languages. Some of these are single languages, some of these are certainly multiple groups of languages. So if we look at the top right-hand corner, we see Tangsa and Haimi, and within Tangsa and Haimi, there are at least 80, that's 80, different groups, each of which speaks their own identifiable linguistic form. Now, some of them are mutually intelligible, some of them are completely unintelligible with each other, some of them are halfway in between, we don't know enough about them, but this level of diversity is quite significant and is probably true for the entire area that we see on the map. The boundary between India and Myanmar is the thick dotted line that's running through the coloured area. The dotted lines on the left-hand side are Indian state divisions. Okay, and in fact, these groups that call themselves Nagas, they are, although they are all known as Nagas, they are not linguistically that closely related to each other. They're all Tibeto-Burman or Trans-Himalayan, but in fact, the languages at the top right-hand corner of your screen are more closely related to languages that are spoken on the plains and in other parts of Burma than they are to the remaining Naga languages. Okay, so given this kind of linguistic and cultural diversity, what are the kinds of areas that need further archiving? And I've listed 4 different areas that I want to talk about here, and I'll just go through these in some detail as quickly as it's possible to do. So there are written materials produced in communities using traditional scripts. Some of these go back several hundred years. There are a number of traditional scripts in use in Northeast India. Today, I can only speak about the Tai scripts because these are the only ones I have any expertise in. We have an existing archive of Tai Ahom at the Endangered Archives program at the British Library. And this was work that I was involved in between 2011 and 2015. But this only really covers the manuscripts of the Tai Ahom, and there are hundreds, if not thousands of manuscripts, some very old, in the other 4 Thai communities and also in Thai communities on the other side of the border in Myanmar. So what are the challenges involved in doing this? Well, in the case of the Tai Ahom, it's one thing to photograph the manuscript. It's another thing altogether to understand what it's about and to translate it. So when we were doing the British Library project, we had to provide metadata quite reasonably. And we had one member of the Tai Ahom community identifying the manuscripts. But this is a language that hasn't been spoken as a mother tongue for close to 250 years. And it's also a language in which the script does not mark all the linguistic features of that language. So, for example, it underrepresents phonemic contrasts such as no tones and also underspecifying vowel contrasts. What this means is that often a single syllable, and it's basically a monosyllabic language, often a single syllable will have at least 15 different meanings. And if there are two words together, that's potentially 15 times 15 meanings. Now, most of those meanings won't make sense, but enough of them will to mean that interpreting these manuscripts is difficult. It's not like documenting manuscripts in, for example, Latin. So if you get an old Latin manuscript, a classical Latin manuscript or classical Latin text written in stone or whatever, and you document it, it can be translated 95% probably by using dictionaries and by someone who has learned Latin. This is a much more difficult task for the Tai Ahom. And so the method that we came up with is shown here. We worked with a community member, linguists, linguistic students, and myself, and experts in Thai literature from another part of the Thai world to come up with the best translation that we could come up with. Very time-consuming, very demanding process, and only a tiny proportion of the manuscripts have been interpreted in that way. And this leads us to the challenge of doing so with the manuscripts of all the other Thai-speaking communities. So we have, as I said, hundreds of manuscripts, of which this one, the Chatupatan, belonging to Nihang in Borola village, is a very nice example. This is a photo I would have taken maybe 10, 12 years back. It's not as high a quality as I would wish it to be. There are challenges involved in photographing in the field, which I could talk about when we have a discussion later. But it's not just that. When these are photographed, what we really need to do is to record the elders reading the manuscript and explaining its meaning. Maybe reading several lines at a time and then explaining what those several lines tell us, so that in the future, we not only have the images, but also an understanding of what it's about. So the second area that I think is important is archiving those efforts made by the community towards orthography and literacy development. So there are examples, partly in manuscript, partly in small run printed books, of this kind of community-led literacy development work. I'll give you a couple of examples. So the first is a primer, probably from the 1970s, printed on very brittle paper on the Burma-Myanmar side of the border. There's very few copies of this because the Ngaimong are one of the Tangsa Naga communities, and their language is different from some other groups. And some people in those other groups objected to the Ngaimong writing their language and said, no, 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 if there's going to be a written language, it has to be our language. So this 50-year-old attempt at orthography was put down by people from other nearby communities. And there hasn't really been an attempt to write the Ngaimong language since then, although we've kind of made a bit of progress in this direction. As you can see, this photo illustrates some of the challenges of taking photos in the field. Put it on a green plastic stool and put the stool out in the sun and taken a photo. Or this example by Ngaimong Primer's book about the culture and festivals of the Tangsas. We need to document what this orthography tells us. His orthography is out of use, it's been discontinued, but the information in here is still valuable, but we don't have this properly documented. And then there is the development of the Tangsa Script. Now, I'm not going to go through each of these stages, but this is really a story that's right now in development, because the script was created in 1990, and for the first 20 years, it was only used and taught to a small number of people. But just in the last 2 or 3 years, it has really expanded. One of my former PhD students created the first font, and then I subsequently redesigned it. And then another former student, Kellen Parker Van Dam, created the version that we're using now. And this allowed us to make a Unicode proposal, and I'd be very happy to talk to anyone who's interested in the Unicode process later, a very, very time-consuming and detailed process, leading to the approval of the script for inclusion in Unicode just a couple of weeks ago, while at the same time, just a month or two before that, the government of Arunachal Pradesh, the state in which most of the peoples wanting to use the script live, approved it for use in teaching. And now it is being taught in schools. There's a teacher training course that's been going on just in the last few days. Here's some examples of the documentation we could put into this. So this is written by the founder, who passed away last July and did not live to see the script included in Unicode, which is rather sad. And this is an example of him teaching his class. It's the only photo we have of him teaching from about 15 years ago, or at least with a group of students. Here's an example of one student's work. Pretty good, this particular work. Only one correction can I see down in item number 20. And these people have been working at this for many years and are now using it for things like shopping lists, which I think is really exciting. Okay, another area that we need to look into is the British era publications and manuscripts. Now, this is complex because tracking them down in libraries, particularly if they're manuscripts, is not straightforward. One of the things that I've been doing in recent days is looking at manuscripts relating to Aboriginal languages of Victoria and looking at references to those manuscripts in publications from the 80s, 90s and 2000s. And you couldn't find those documents from those references because libraries have reorganized things and they can't now be found from those 1980s and 1990s references. So that's one issue. Second thing is that there are government documents that so far we haven't been able to find. And the third thing is that some of the well-preserved and available documents are not available free to community members. So someone will ask me, can I get such and such? And I have to download it using my La Trobe login. And some publications, and more particularly manuscripts, have fallen into collectors' hands and are simply unavailable to the scholarship community. And this is an example of this. So this is this transcription of mine on the right is a typescript that Colonel Edmund Rich made in the 1920s, containing really very important information for those communities. And I had the opportunity to sit and look at it in a book fair in Melbourne University's Wilson Hall, and I just had to type as quickly as possible. And you can see the errors that I have made. Bisa lidai ian intelligent simple, should have been is an intelligent simple. But this actually is important because his grandson is a friend of mine, and this information needs to get back to community. And finally, the last point I want to make is to talk about video and audio recordings made by community members. So there's likely to be significant recordings made by community members in the past, and they will contain important information, for example, about traditional songs and stories. We need to find them, we need to list them, we need to copy them, we need to prepare metadata, digitize them, archive them. And increasingly, people are putting things on YouTube. So here's an example of a recording of very poor quality made in about 1980 by the late Kiang La, the Gaumbra village headman of Gumchai Gong. Kiang La was close to 100 when he passed away in about 2012. I think he was born in 1916. He was able to identify who the singer was and the fact that the song is accompanied by a traditional fiddle, but we can't make out what's actually on it. And more recently, there are items that have been put onto YouTube by community members themselves. And this, I think, is the last point I want to make. But I also want to make the point that this is going to be important for archiving and documentation into the future. So I've divided the kinds of things that I have seen on the internet into these two categories, those that are part of newspaper reports and those that are community produced materials. Now, I have done my best to document both the Tangsa, which is the community referred to in number A there, and the Tai Pake in B, but the things that are documented in these recordings are not ones that I have had a chance to document. I think I've run out of time to actually show you what those look like. But for example, the Mole Festival that is mentioned in the first one, they include there the Sapporo dance. Now, I have got lots of documentation of the Sapporo dance, but not in its traditional setting of the Mole Festival. Similarly, I do have videos of the Padesa, which is the Tai Pake mentioned in number B, but the recording that they have made contains things that I have not been able to archive. So I think I best finish it there.